In 1986, Tony Iommi stood in the studio with Glenn Hughes, former singer of Deep Purple. Together, they had made a powerful album called Seventh Star. But there was a problem. This wasn't a Black Sabbath album. At least, that's what Tony thought. He wanted it to be a solo record, something different, something personal. Yet the label had other plans. Don Arden, the sharp and tough music manager, walked in with news. The label wanted to slap the Black Sabbath name on it. Tony was furious. This wasn't the heavy doom sound fans expected. Glenn Hughes was singing in a soulful, bluesy voice, unlike Ozzy or Ronnie, and that's where the conflict began. Glenn Hughes wasn't even supposed to be a Sabbath singer. He had already carved his place in rock history with Deep Purple and Trapeze. When Tony called, Glenn saw it as a chance to try something fresh. But he didn't walk in thinking, "I'm joining Black Sabbath." He thought he was helping Tony with a solo vision. In Glenn's mind, this was Tony's record. He sang differently, smoother, less metal, more soul. But when the record label decided to release it under Black Sabbath's name, Glenn suddenly found himself in a strange position, the new singer of a band he never agreed to join. It all came down to the very last song. Glenn remembers it clearly. Don Arden and the label executives sat in, listening to the mixes. At the end, Arden delivered the news like a bomb. The label wants to call it Black Sabbath. Tony's face fell. This wasn't the plan. He didn't want Sabbath's name dragged into this. But the label smelled money. Sabbath's name sold records. Glenn Hughes recalls how upset Tony was. His dream of a solo record had just been hijacked. Suddenly, the creative freedom he wanted was gone. For Tony, Sabbath had been his life, but also his cage. Every time he tried to step outside the band's image, the label pulled him back. Nth Star was supposed to be different. It had keyboards, blues influences, even lighter moments. Tony wanted to experiment, but when Arden insisted it would be called Black Sabbath featuring Tony Iommi, Tony felt trapped. Glenn could see the frustration in him, like a man whose own name wasn't enough for the industry. For Glenn, the confusion was even worse. Fans suddenly expected him to sing like Ozzy or Dio. But Glenn wasn't either of them. He was a soul singer with a hard rock edge. On stage, fans looked at him and thought, "This isn't Black Sabbath." Glenn admits he never felt like a Sabbath singer. He was helping Tony, not replacing anyone. And that misunderstanding haunted the whole tour. The album dropped as Black Sabbath featuring Tony Iommi. Fans were confused. Critics weren't sure what to make of it. Some loved Glenn's powerful vocals. Others said it didn't sound like Sabbath at all. For Glenn, it was pressure he never asked for. He respected the band's legacy, but didn't want to wear a crown that wasn't his. He has said many times, "I am not a Black Sabbath singer." When the tour started, the problems grew. Glenn struggled with his voice after an injury during rehearsals, and fans still wanted the classic Sabbath songs. Glenn was singing from a different world: blues, soul, rock. The mismatch became obvious. Tony wanted to support him, but the audience wasn't ready. Glenn recalls those nights as some of the toughest of his career. Despite the chaos, Glenn and Tony built a deep bond. Glenn admired Tony's vision, his courage to try something new, even if the world wasn't ready. Tony, in turn, trusted Glenn's voice and spirit, but they were both caught in the storm of label politics. What was meant to be Tony's rebirth as a solo artist turned into a confusing chapter in Sabbath's history. Years later, Glenn has spoken openly. He laughs at the situation now, but also defends Tony's original idea. He insists the album should never have been called Black Sabbath. For Glenn, the music was strong, the songs were alive, but the marketing ruined it. He wanted fans to hear it as something fresh, not as another Sabbath record. In the end, Seventh Star became both a hidden gem and a cautionary tale. For Tony, it was proof that even legends could lose control of their own art. For Glenn, it was a reminder that labels often cared more about names than music. And for fans, it became a story of what could have been. Glenn sums it up simply: I was never a Black Sabbath singer. I was just helping my friend Tony. When the album hit shelves, fans picked it up expecting heavy riffs and doom-filled Sabbath classics. What they got instead was a mixture of blues, rock, and soulful singing. For many, it was confusing. Some die-hard fans rejected it outright, calling it not Sabbath. Others, though, were intrigued by the fresh sound. Glenn remembers standing on stage, feeling the tension in the air, some fans cheering, others crossing their arms. It was like being dropped into a world where he was both celebrated and doubted at the same time. The road only made things harder. Glenn injured his voice early on during rehearsals when he was struck in the throat. From then on, singing was painful. Night after night, he tried to push through. The audiences didn't know what he was going through. They just thought he wasn't hitting the notes. The pressure was crushing. Glenn later admitted that this period tested him in ways he had never experienced before. For a man who had fronted Deep Purple, this was supposed to be another high point. Instead, it became one of his hardest challenges. Behind the scenes, Tony Iommi carried his own frustration. He loved Glenn's talent but hated Hughes. The label had boxed them into a corner. He had wanted Seventh Star to stand alone, but now it was stuck in Sabbath's history, forever compared to Paranoid and Heaven and Hell. Tony rarely spoke about it then, but Glenn recalls how hurt Tony looked when people dismissed the record. It wasn't about money or fame. It was about his voice as a musician being silenced. That silence made him angrier than anything else. Over the years, Seventh Star faded into the background. When fans spoke of Sabbath, they mentioned Ozzy, Dio, or even later singers like Tony Martin. Glenn's role often went overlooked, but those who listened closely knew the truth. This was a record unlike anything Sabbath had done before. It was bluesy, experimental, almost spiritual in places. Some call it a lost treasure, others a mistake. But Glenn Hughes always stood by one thing. I was never supposed to be the Sabbath singer. I was there to help Tony. Looking back, both men took lessons from the chaos. For Glenn, it proved that you cannot control what labels and managers will do with your art. For Tony, it was a reminder that even legends fight battles outside the studio. And for fans, Seventh Star remains a reminder of how messy rock history can be. How behind every record, there are clashes, heartbreaks, and dreams that don't always come true. Today, Glenn speaks with respect and warmth about Tony, making it clear this wasn't failure, it was simply a misunderstood chapter. And sometimes, misunderstood chapters are the ones that keep the legend alive.